Capes get a lot of attention in comics. We should be giving things like cloaks some attention too for a change. The artist who drew the first year of that volume of Ghost Rider actually drew one of my variant covers. Almost surreal to see those artistic fingerprints, that style, drawing a character I made up. Last year when they watched Honor Among Thieves, the D&D movie, if you knew anybody that watched it that wasn't a D&D fan, and you can finally say, yeah, you like something that I do all the time, but I bit off a lot. I was able to chew it all. It's trial by fire, really.
Stick around to the end of the interview for a trailer of the Madcaps comic. Today, I have a special guest with us, Ray Jameson. He also goes by DM Ray. We connected over Facebook, and he has a really interesting Kickstarter that we're going to talk about later. I can't wait to dig into this. Most of you who follow the podcast know that I'm a writer, very interested in things that are getting published that touch on the tabletop space. Ray, why don't you introduce yourself to us, tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got into tabletop, into the nerd fandom, if you will, anything that we can relate to and get to know who you are.
Okay, my name is Ray Jameson. I'm also known as DM Ray, DM being short for Dungeon Master. Anything nerdy, in my opinion, if I had to define it, would be anything that is, or at least used to be, considered unpopular. There's a lot of mainstream nerd stuff now. Intellectual. When I was a kid, I loved comic books. I used to read a lot of them thanks to my older brother. I was in that sweet spot of the era where comic books started to get into cartoons heavily. Late 80s, early 90s, and then it all exploded from there, from Blade in 98, X-Men in 2000, and then of course Spider-Man 2, which was an even exponentially huger explosion. When I was in elementary school, comics weren't considered cool. Not too many of us liked them, and it was really neat to see the transition of where I lived and everything kind of shift into an accepted cartoon and eventually movies, and now the powerhouses these things are nowadays. I didn't start playing tabletop games, in specific D&D, until I was in my late 20s. I just turned 40. So just over a decade. The main reason I wanted to get into tabletop, basically I moved across country and I couldn't see my friends anymore. I decided to set up some webcams, set up a vinyl board. I had everybody pick out a piece and mail it to me to make it more personal. It was literally just to hang out with my friends that I couldn't see face to face anymore.
So were you doing it online back then?
I was doing it without the aid of any platform. I was doing it literally over Google Hangouts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I would have a laptop and a computer and multiple cameras, so they could look at me and they could look over top of the board and they would tell me what to do. And it was all honor system for rolling, which I'm perfectly fine with. Bad rolls are awesome. We had a lot of fun doing that. Fast forward the clock 10 plus years later, when I first started playing D&D, before we fast forward the clock, I was overambitious. I shouldn't say overambitious, but I bit off a lot. I was able to chew it all, but I didn't go off of any modules. I made my own homebrew campaign. It was all its own lore. I didn't use anything in regards to anything trademarked by Forgotten Realms or Wizards of the Coast or anything like that. Moving forward, the fast forward, as I was mentioning, I wanted to do a comic book and I made a mini-series. First issue is done and it's based off of the first homebrew campaign that I ran with my friends. The only main difference is I subbed out the players' characters and I made my own characters.
Right.
Launches on April 30th. The core story about it is about 4 friends that haven't seen each other in a while, which kind of reflects my own life in a way. I'm sure yourself and every other human being, especially after they leave high school, they don't get to see specific circles of friends as much as they want to. But when they do, when they finally get to see each other, even if it's only going to a restaurant and catching up, it could be a percentage of the shenanigans that you used to do.
Right.
But when you leave your recharge, your very essence, I really needed that, is usually a thought that crosses your mind. This comic is kind of an homage to that level of camaraderie and friendship. These 4 friends, essentially, they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's a really bad situation. Because of the influence they have on each other, they decide to step up and act. And I think a lot of people, when they're around their friends, like I'm a parent, if something bad happens, my first thought is make sure my kids are safe. If I'm around my friends and not around my kids, there's a good chance I would think differently. I just kind of reflect on that concept. The whole series over the 3 issues takes place over one night. It's a very intimate setting. Really, it's almost like either meeting zero or the first meeting you would have in a D&D setting. It's not quite establishing a backstory. These characters are not the mightiest in the land. In this first issue, 3 of them almost get killed early on. It has some really good reminiscent of, I already mentioned camaraderie, but it really has a good tabletop feel to it as well. I guess a really good way of putting it is if you back this campaign, you're basically backing one of your own.
Right. I love that you put it that way. So I want to go back to, you started out with comics back in the day when we were growing up. You mentioned X-Men, the X-Men cartoon. Are you catching up on the new one, the X-Men 97?
You know what? Because I'm doing my rounds promoting this, I'm going to wait till it's all out.
Got it.
Going to catch up. I am looking forward to it. I think whenever you see these reboots or continuations that are coming out lately, I'm always very, very hesitant. I've been hearing a lot of good about it, and it makes me feel better. It can be done really bad. Like, for example, Fallout just came out. I was a big Fallout fan.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking like Fallout 3, which had a big, huge boom in fans. I'm talking like point and click, turn-based Fallout 1, Fallout 2.
Yeah.
Frank Horrigan, not even just the Enclave, Frank Horrigan, if you're a big fan of Fallout. And this TV show came out. I've been hearing a lot of good about that, and I had the same concerns. I was very concerned that it could easily be botched. I didn't want it Zack Snydered, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Just strip mine all the good stuff, throw it together in a blender. There you go, and there's nowhere to go with it. Apparently, it's quite the opposite. X-Men 97, same thing. I'm really happy to hear good things.
Okay. What was your favorite comic then growing up?
Favorite comic book? Well, there was 2. They were both Marvel. The first one was Daredevil. I liked the idea of a lawyer who, putting his powers aside, a lawyer who was frustrated with the law, not being able to fix everything. So he was both sides of the coin depending on what hour of the day it was. I always thought I liked that concept.
Yeah.
Another one, the first one I collected issue to issue was the 2nd volume run of Ghost Rider, where Dan Kemp took over as the rider. Eventually, Johnny Blaze hunts him down and tries to pacify him, which is a really cool story. That's actually a very interesting segue. The artist who drew the first year of that volume of Ghost Rider actually drew one of my variant covers.
Oh, really?
Yes, that was a really cool full circle moment for me.
Now, I think you sent me some of these. Which one was it?
The dwarf holding the golden axe.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. And you know what? Now I can kind of see the art style does seem a little bit different from some of the other ones that you sent me.
That one, Javier Saltares, when I was a kid, I watched his stuff. So it was really, really not mind-boggling, but it was almost surreal to see those artistic fingerprints, that style drawing a character I made up. When I saw just the black and white, the inks of that image, it looked like something out of the panels of something I read as a kid.
Yeah.
And then just to see that come to life. The person who colored it, his name is Dan Kemp. He's colored over 100 issues of Spawn. He colored Spider-Man during the Civil War era. A lot of Marvel Knights with Daredevil, the Inhumans, and those two have never crossed paths before. I've gotten a couple of good comments from fans of these 2 artists. They'd say things like, it's so impressive that you got these 2 souls to cross paths. And it's really funny when you think about it, because Ghost Rider is basically a demon Spawn, and then Spawn is, of course, a demon Spawn, and those 2 artists kind of combined and made this really cool image. I'm really happy with that.
That's got to be like your crown jewel piece, probably, huh?
It's definitely nothing short of satisfying. The person that dwarf is based off of, him and I growing up through school, we used to talk comics a lot, and we talk about, you mentioned X-Men or Spider-Man, the animated series, of course Kevin Conroy and Batman, the animated series, and we used to talk all about this stuff. So to add another layer of the surrealness, this fella that I watched his art and he actually drew one of my friends essentially, which is kind of cool.
Wow, that's so cool. How did you, we're going to get back to D&D. How
Sure.
did you get into, did you just play D&D and then have this idea, I'm going to turn this into a comic? Did you have connections already? How did you start this process?
So I'm kind of scared every answer I'm going to give is going to like throw up another 5 questions.
It probably will.
I'll give you the short version. It's on the back burner right now. It's still cooking, but I'm actually putting together a board game. I wanted the art to look comic book. So I found a local artist here in Winnipeg, Evan Quiring. Shout out to Evan. He has his own comic series. He's got a couple out, Murder City Devil, and there's also Lucha Mysteries, and Cyclone Studios is where you can find him. I liked what he made for me, and the art is obviously in the vault metaphorically. At the time, I asked, what do you think about doing an interior? Because I had a story in my mind. I kicked around the different how many issues and stuff, and eventually I settled on 3. So he drew out the first one, and all of the pages, all the interiors. And then again, Dan Kemp, who I mentioned earlier, the colorist for Spawn, he colored all the interiors. I just asked, and these people said yes. I'm still beside myself.
So like you just sent them an email, or like you sent them a letter, or did you know them personally?
I found them on social media.
And you just asked if they would color it, and
Yeah.
they said, yeah, that's
Yeah, that's pretty
amazing.
much it. I was told once, in most cases in life, it never hurts to ask something. There's many artists I've got no from. These ones said yes, and they actually just took a chance. And yeah, it's really cool to see. Issue number 1 is finished, and I've read it digitally. I don't have it printed yet. Wow, this is an actual comic book. This is really, really cool. Just to finalize the answer to your question, I started with a board game. The artist kind of inspired me to. I had this story already. I refined it, as I said, with the characters. It took a life on its own by that point. It just organically came together. The only kicker was I consider myself not necessarily paranoid, but a very careful person. I did not want to release this book till I felt it was worthy of the industry. The right colorist, the right covers, the right letterer, and this has been going on for 2 years. The second book, the second issue, will not take 2 years to make, but I wanted to make sure I had the right tone, the right everything.
Right.
Yeah, that's more or less how it began, unintentionally, basically.
Wow. I feel like, okay, let's backtrack then. So you were trying to make a board game.
Yes.
And that led to making a comic. So what was
based off of D&D, yes.
And the board game was also based off of the same content, essentially?
No,
no?
Board game, I can't say too much about. It's based off of 80s slasher movies.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that.
Basically, one of the players has to be the slasher. They can pick between 5 different slashers. They're all cliche parodies off of pre-existing 80s slasher movie characters. I obviously don't want to get sued, so I can't use the real deal.
Yeah.
It takes place on a camp, and it's about camp counselors. They have to find equipment and fend themselves off. Either there's at least one camp counselor surviving, or they defeat the slasher, one of the two.
Wow. I think 80s stuff right now it definitely has kind of its own audience right now with the folks who are our age that are reliving their,
yes. Well,
their youth.
I saw a meme not too long ago, and it was more like didn't feel like a meme, but it was obviously in the format, and it showed an old poster of Generation 1 Transformers versus Decepticons. In the middle of space, you can see Cybertron in the background and stuff, and it's just captioned, and just like that, 1984 was 40 years ago. I thought, yeah, it was, wasn't it?
It's crazy, right? Okay, now we're going to go back to D&D. What version of D&D did you start off with? Was it 3.5?
Well, unfortunately, I was late to the game. I started just over 10 years ago, so I'm only familiar with 5th edition. I've heard 3.5 is the best. And people try not to mention the edition in between.
Yeah. I think 3.5 definitely has its place. I think 5e has its place as well right now. 5e is great for people to bring people in. And then I think when they're ready for something a little more crunchy, you can go back to 3.5. I think 5e definitely opens the door for more people. I want to kind of cover, like, did you play first, or did you just dive straight into DMing?
I've been a player I can count on one hand. I've always been a dungeon master.
So you just felt perfectly comfortable running a game that you had rarely played or barely
Never
played?
played. I'm an extrovert. Out of all of my circle of friends, I consider myself the most extrovert. In my mind, if I don't do it, nobody's going to do it. So I
Yeah.
just stepped up and I was a dungeon master.
Wow. Did you already have friends that were like, I'm interested in playing, and so out of necessity, you decided to be the DM?
No, we were all new to the game.
Okay.
I should say as adults, we were all new to the game. I had a couple friends that played when they were super young, so pretty much starting from scratch. I have a side piece of information to give you.
Sure.
Promoting this campaign, I've played D&D with a couple of pros a couple of times, and I got them to play a one-shot with me and a couple of different comic writers who've played D&D. We have a one-shot. I'm going to be releasing it most likely before the Kickstarter drops, and it's a prequel to issue 1. It's the equivalent of Rogue One just before A New Hope.
Okay.
People that like fantasy don't necessarily like comics and vice versa. There's not a lot of overlap. My intentions were, if you like fantasy, watch this one shot, and if you liked what you saw, the story keeps going.
Right.
So give it a shot. Or alternatively, people who like comics don't necessarily like fantasy too much. They're usually superheroes. If you watch this and enjoyed it, you have an idea of what this comic is about. I think people will be more inclined to give me a chance.
Yeah, no, it's a smart idea, I think, to do something like that. Once people are bought into something that you produce, the more that you can give them surrounding that, I think only just builds that out even more. So I think what you've done is very smart there. I'm very interested in this idea that you said, okay, well, I'm just going to jump into DMing, never played before. And then you decided to homebrew, right? Is that did you just went straight to homebrew? You've never run a
Yes.
module or anything like that. Can I ask, I keep a tally in my head. What was the reason for going straight into homebrew versus a module or some pre-written adventure?
So for me, for homebrew, the biggest challenge, just being thrown into the fire like this, obviously self-inflicted, of course. The biggest challenge was understanding the mechanics of the game. My logic, because that was my biggest challenge, in my opinion, I didn't also want to be constrained by a module.
Right.
If everything's on my terms, I'm sure every dungeon master knows the players don't know exactly how much is ad-libbed.
Right.
And I did have notes and stuff, but because I wrote it, it was memorized. Like I had it for reference, but I know what's going on.
Right.
Now it's just down to mechanics of the game, and that's pretty much combat. All the storytelling, I didn't have to remember, and this person says this at this point, or if you did that quest earlier, make sure to include this person.
Right.
That felt overwhelming, so I just did my own thing.
I like that. Yeah, that seems to be the consensus when I ask people that question. So I'm always curious. I'm waiting for the one time somebody says something different. I can't wait to see what that's going to be like. So that's very ambitious to homebrew. I think that's great. I always want to promote people homebrewing. Did you wait to finish this campaign and then get the idea, I should turn this into a comic? Or was it during the process, or did your friend say, hey, you should turn this into a comic? Like, how did that come about, the idea of turning this into a comic?
Like I was saying earlier, the whole dynamic of turning it into a comic was completely by accident due to my other project and crossing paths with this comic artist.
Right.
It was completely unintentional, but at the same time very organic. So it just kind of naturally came out. When I wrote the script for all 3 issues and finished it, I just really enjoyed how it all came together. I think anybody that enjoys one-shots, they'll watch this. Each issue, like I was saying, the whole thing takes place over one night. Each issue is one act. If you imagine, yes, we stopped these thugs who are working for, I'm saying something completely separate to my comic, but
Right.
we find thugs, they're working for this cleric, and then eventually you're trying to slay Cthulhu. And don't get me wrong, that escalated quickly, what I just said. But anybody who's gone through a one-shot where you're rooting out a problem, it's not exactly railroaded, but at the same time, it's not as free playing.
Right.
Because of that, it's beginning, middle, end with these acts. You know there's an ending. So from a reader's perspective, from a D&D perspective, one-shots are great. Some people like it just ongoing, which is also equally awesome. From a reader's perspective, you know when the end is. And
Right.
you watch a movie or read a book, you want to know there's an ending. So in that case, yeah, it gives a very, very one-shot kind of feel.
When you decided to turn this into a comic, and you did mention something about changing up the characters a bit, I'm assuming they're inspired by what happened, but you made some changes. How did the players feel about that? Did you need to gain any kind of permissions or reach out to them or discuss it in any way?
They were all cool with it, but I didn't tell them right away.
Okay.
I'm the kind of person, if I need to put shingles on a house, if I tell 40 people, suddenly I'm talking to 40 so-called experts, roofers. Don't use those shingles, use these shingles.
Right.
Do it at this type of the year. I'm a big fan of holding back project plans and then announcing them when they're close to done. Another good example, any parent out there, if they tell the baby's name before the baby's born,
Right.
don't name the baby that, name the baby this.
Yeah.
But if you announce the name after, they're not going to contest it. They're not going to
Right.
say, that's a terrible name. They're just going to leave it be. My friends, the story's the same, but I took their characters out because I didn't want... Human nature's a funny thing, and I'm not saying my friends would do this, but I didn't want to put them in a position of temptation to try and
Right.
fix me for money. Money's a weird thing, especially with friends, and I just wanted to avoid that altogether.
I get that. I understand that.
I guess the last thing I'll say about that is when I did announce it, they were all very, very happy to see it. And the people that the players' characters I took out, well, I essentially I took their characters out. I put them in it. So it was pretty natural. They were just flattered.
So is it the events stayed the same, but the people are different? Or were the events even changed? It was more like your comic is inspired by, but not necessarily the same exact thing
There are
that happened.
differences. Another reason I put in my own characters is because I have a better opportunity to make them jive a little better. I mean, if you're playing a tabletop RPG, sometimes the characters don't get along that well, or they don't have a lot of character development together. They function fine, the game is played great, but from a story perspective, I wanted it to gel a little bit better in certain areas.
And you said these were 4 friends. Can you tell us a little bit about the characters in the comic?
Absolutely. Do you have the images there? So we just talked about Javier Saltares' image, so I'll stick with that to begin. So he's a dwarf. His name is Sarlacc Swamp Trudger. He comes from a group of dwarves. The reason he's called Swamp Trudger, that's his clan name, they're a group of dwarves that left the mountain and wanted to farm. Being as stubborn dwarves can be, they decided to farm and clear out a swamp, essentially terraforming the area. Because of that, culturally, those specific dwarves are really good at tracking down and pacifying things that go bump in the night, because swamplands traditionally have lots of yucky things in them. He personally, when he in his late adolescence, he moved into a human city called Ivywood. That's where the story takes place. He worshipped something known as the divine, and he wanted to be just a beacon of light in Ivywood. The bigger the city, the more shifty and shady things there are. There's more people who are not too fortunate, and he made a humble small church, and he tries to be some type of beacon of light to those less fortunate than him. He has some divine benefits to him. That axe he holds is actually a holy weapon. That image, I wanted it to look like he was... I don't want to use the word fearless. I feel it's the wrong word, but I wanted him to look comfortable in the middle of danger.
Yeah.
Originally, when I proposed this to Harv, I was suggesting swinging his axe, taking out like 3 skeletons and a bunch of monsters ready to jump up on his back. And my intention was I wanted him to have a level of calmness that a quarterback would have amongst all the chaos going around him. He knows he's getting tackled in 3 seconds, and he's trying to milk that final half second to get that perfect pass. Harv did the opposite, and he knocked it out of the park, and kind of gave more of a David and Goliath scenario where he's taking down that big, ugly monster, holding it by the head. The look on his face, he doesn't look distraught. He doesn't look exhausted.
Oh, yeah.
He looks as though this is what my people do. And
Yeah.
I'm really happy with how that turned out. Essentially, he doesn't really have a specific class. If I had to squeeze him into D&D, Ranger Cleric, kind of like a multi.
That's what I was thinking too. I mean, the holy
Something to that
weapon,
equivalent.
the tracking of the monsters. Yeah.
That would be the closest. Another thing I wanted him to really look like is for someone wielding an axe, wearing a hood with a cloak. That's not something you see too often. I wanted him to look like his own thing.
Hmm.
He has a little bit of chainmail on one shoulder and one forearm. Yeah, if I had to squeeze him into classes, it would be that. Closest equivalent.
All right. So then the next one looks like kind of a form of like a lizard man, dragonborn,
Okay.
something.
So that fella's name is Madracus Darthual. He is a creature very uncommon known as, it's spelled W-Y-R, it's pronounced Wur. He's actually a descendant of what is known as the Great Stormworm. That is essentially a giant kaiju-like electric eel.
Wow.
One of the cool things Madracus can do, something he's inherited from this creature, he's able to store lightning in his gizzard and essentially just vomit it on people.
I love it. I like
He
that you use the word vomit, which gives it just a different texture of power.
Yes.
I love
Yes.
that.
Much like how a snake can store venom in its fangs, or how a skunk has that terrible defense mechanism, Madracus can't just spit out lightning all the time. He's not
Hmm.
overpowered like that. He definitely has limits to what he can do with that. He's 6.5 feet tall, and he clears 350 pounds in body weight. Most people view him as some type of mercenary, especially with that armor and that sword, but he's not really a skilled fighter. That armor is ceremonial. It kind of reflects his culture. He doesn't know too much about, but he clings to his culture a lot for the little that he does know. And the most intimidating thing about this guy is actually his brain, and he dabbles with the arcane. The cover doesn't, it's that cliche phrase, don't judge a cover by its book. Very different from what your first impressions of him would be. He grew up in Ivywood as well. Ivywood is half founded by orcs, and youthful orcs used to try and use him as a metric of how tough one could be.
Ah,
So he doesn't have a good experience or good feelings towards the town. In fact, right at the start of the comic, him and the little guy, which we haven't talked about yet, they just get to town. Madracus is talking about, I would like to be here as little as possible. At one point, as they enter the town, just right at within the first 3 pages, the captain of the guard at the main gate says, "We need to know your names." So little guy says his name. Madracus says his name, and then you see a bunch of guards ready to square off with him, and he just says, "Ivywood's charges against me were dropped," and then they all look away
hmm.
like, "Oh, I don't want to start any trouble," like something to us, that kind of thing.
I like that. That's great. You mentioned the little guy, and there's two
Little guy.
pictures, and I'm trying to figure out which one would be the little guy. I'm
So that's
assuming
the
it's the.
one. Yeah, there's a moon in the background. He's got goggles on his face.
Okay, so he's the little guy. All
The
right.
little guy, his name is Dunanini. He's half gnome, half dwarf. He doesn't really feel like he fits in too well with either of those two cultures. He does tap into both bloodlines. Unlike his mother, who has magical influence on nature in the wild, he seems to have, instead of in the wild, he has a similar influence on metals and crystalline structures. So over his shoulder, you'll see it's actually I wouldn't call it a device, it's more like a contraption he's kind of just made work. It's
Uh-huh.
actually a telescope, and it can blast raw magic out of it like a cannon.
Wow. And
So
it's a
if you look in,
telescope.
yeah, if you look in the foreground of that image, you'll see it's a tree stump. He just shot that. So
Yeah.
that's why you can see the expression on his face. That's the first time he shot it. There's equal thoughts of it worked and also I'm still alive.
Yeah. I love that.
You can see a smithing hammer in his hand, so the hammerhead is metal, so you can see it's actually glowing because he can actually heat it up accordingly.
So what how else does this power manifest? Because it sounds like you the way that you described it, I'm envisioning his parents or some kind of like, translating to D&D, but like druids, right? With power over nature. How does his power over like metals and stuff kind of embody itself? Can he shape them? Can he
He came across this by accident. He's not exactly sure. If I was a human and I had no influence around me, would I be able to learn how to walk? And
Hmm.
it's an interesting thought experiment, but with him, he has these abilities. He has no adults or teachers. He's kind of unique in that respect. He refers to himself as kind of like a gnome dwarf mutt, but some weird byproduct is he's kind of just discovering what exactly he can do with this kind of stuff. So that telescope, it only works if his goggles are on. He actually has them linked arcanically.
Okay.
The hammer, like you see he's able to actually heat metal. You can see that he's not exactly sure what his abilities fully are, just because it's so unorthodox of a bloodline.
That's really cool. I mean, he kind of feels like he's an artificer, but not. I like the idea of thinking that he's like a druid of metals, though. That I like that much better than thinking he's
Yeah,
an
I
artificer.
one thing I really liked about him, now I said he's the little guy, and it's funny because there's also a dwarf there. He's just under 4 feet in height, and
Uh-huh.
I liked the idea of this little tiny creature being able to just turn a full-grown tree into splinters. I just
Yeah.
find that just like comical.
That's so
But
cool.
you're the first person to word it like that. I would have never thought it that way, but it's almost like a druid of steel. I think
Yeah.
that's a neat way of putting it.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by that idea now, and I want to do something with that too.
Oh yeah.
Oh boy. All right, and then we have this fourth character who looks a little shady, maybe
So
sneaking.
he's a specific type of elf. His name is Chasgo Blundale. He comes from a specific group of elves known as Argers. Argers live in a specific mountain range that is riddled with silver deposits. So I don't know if you're aware of this dynamic with humans. If you consume enough silver, it actually tattoos your skin blue. You ever heard of that
Okay.
before?
I feel like I'd heard rumors. I don't know that I'd looked into it much.
You can look it up on like YouTube. One guy was really famous. He was actually on Oprah. He looks like a Smurf. Like it's really wild, but it's legit. His
Wow.
eye, the whites of his eyes are blue. All of them's blue. It's kind of freaky. So this character Chasgo, generationally, all of those elves have been exposed to silver for so long. They all naturally have this blue pigment to them.
Wow.
Humans die from this, but he's an elf, so we're gonna let that part slide. But anyways, because of this silver running through his system, he actually has resistance to magic. Argers, these type of elves, are considered xenophobic. They want nothing to do with outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually worship the mountain. They feel the mountain, they're half right. They feel the mountain is giving them these blessings of why they have resistance to magic. And they view magic as like an abomination.
Right.
So they feel worshiping the mountain protects them from abominations. So
Yeah.
mercenaries, mages, they stay away from the mountain range. They want nothing to do. I mean, you have a really powerful mage. Anything they could pull off is not going to be nearly as potent. So
Yeah.
it kind of nullifies or pacifies. Ironically, this individual, he viewed his family and his people in specific as dysfunctional. He felt a little different from them. He wanted to leave the mountain range, but he was taught if all outsiders are evil, essentially. By chance, he came across, and you can see on his necklace, there's a chess piece there. It's a rook.
Okay.
He found this rook, he picked it up. For a brief moment in time, he was blinded, and he was approached by something known only as Annette. Annette says, I understand your frustrations. I would like you to be the first of leading Argers out of the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And you more or less be a champion, or to put it in modern terms, a spokesperson of encouraging Argers to leave, and B, showing other people that not all Argers are bad. For those to leave the mountain, they need people to accept them.
Mm-hmm.
So he accepted, and ironically, he's resistant to magic, but he also has magical gifts given to him by this individual known as Annette. A lot of it is based off of, it looks like light, looks like a bluish light, so it's kind of interesting because he's very, very dark looking.
Yeah.
But a lot of the things he can do is very, very bright. In that image, it was drawn by Erica Hollis. Chasgo is entering a lit room while donning a human disguise. Now, right now, in the story, the three other individuals are the only ones that know what Chasgo is, being
Mm-hmm.
this Arger or elf. Everybody else thinks he's human. One of his magical gifts given to him was for protection, to hide what he looks like. He's actually worked his way up in the ranks. He actually represents a noble, which is kind of interesting because he's so close to trouble, metaphorically. The
Yeah.
only thing protecting him really is this magical veil, if you will, which is kind of...
Yeah.
I
I
think
love the development of the character, that the backstory of these characters is very interesting.
the one thing I really like is each one of them, I wanted them to feel unique to their surroundings. And for one reason or another, I think every individual can relate to at least one character. So the last one I said there was Chasgo.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's lots of people, and I'm not saying they should be, but there's lots of people that feel they're embarrassed of their roots or where they come from. And
Right.
that could be for various reasons. Maybe not the best of parents, or maybe they were embarrassed that they came from a certain country. I think lots of people can relate to that, or sometimes people can't hide that kind of stuff. So you have Madracus, this giant
Mm-hmm.
scaly individual. You can't hide that stuff, so he does the opposite. He embraces it, and he wears things that reflect his culture. The dwarf who moved into a human city, another example of that. Or in the last one, you have somebody who's half of one thing and half another. And well, what is my identity? Does that have some type of representation of me, or am I supposed to just glean what I have and move forward?
Is that a major theme that runs through your comic then? Kind of this idea of identity and belonging?
Well, the one thing I wanted to do is I wanted to make sure they all looked unique. One of the reasons they're friends is because all of them in that town are not human. Although it's not a nice comparison, I'm sure going through high school, well, these people would just kind of got herded together and were friends through high school. Kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Because they're so different, they were just basically a miscellaneous group, if you will. Madcaps
Misfits.
yeah, I
Breakfast Club.
hesitate. Technically, yes. I hesitate to use the word, but you're not wrong.
Yeah.
And the word madcap just means eccentric.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of fitting of these four.
That's right. And we hadn't even brought up the title yet. So I'm glad that you did. Yeah, and Madcaps is the title of this comic, correct?
Yes,
Okay. You have 3 in the works, is that correct?
3 issues total, yes.
3
It's
issues
in,
total,
this
and
is
that's
my,
that's the beginning and end of the story, or are there plans for
yes.
more?
So this
Okay.
is the first comic I've ever written. So one thing I wanted to do is I wanted to surround myself with talent. It's also one of the reasons. Another reason why this has taken over 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted the right people, but it's up to the readers to decide if I've written a half decent story. I'm not arrogant enough to say this is going to be a monthly series and I'm going to last the next 50 years.
Right.
I would rather, I want to make something really cool and release it. If something cool happens after that, that's great and all, but my mind is not there. I just want these issues to be great,
Yeah.
and nothing else is really on the table in my mind.
Okay. I wanted to touch on the setting because in the images it's almost like I don't know if it's because it's the art style because comics evoke kind of a modern day society, but it is in a fantasy setting, or is it like kind of a hybrid fantasy modern setting or
It's definitely not modern. It's definitely a medieval fantasy feel.
okay.
Again, I just tried to make it my own thing, and
Mm-hmm.
that comes from me homebrewing everything.
Right.
I wanted to make sure it was something I did. One thing I was always worried about making this is I didn't want to do something that's been done a bunch of times. So
Right.
this is a comic book. Let's pretend I had my own superhero stories and my own universe. And, well, lots of people do that, and they do a great job. And I'm not just talking about the big two like Marvel and DC or Image or Dark Horse or any of those. Lots of people, and in the indie crowd too. And if I wanted to be humbly successful in this, at least, I'm one voice in a sea of people shouting. I wanted to try just something different, so I did a fantasy setting, and I feel that it's unique enough that people will be more inclined to give it a chance.
Yeah.
I really think that, or my apologies. The other thing I wanted to say about it is I didn't want to release it just because I think it's cool. I wanted to release it when I thought, and I think I used this phrase already, worthy of the industry. So
Right.
from the writer's perspective, I've had some people read the script to all 3, including my now publisher, Philip Russert at Philbo Publishing in New York. Super happy he took me on. But from the people that have read all 3 issues, I haven't really gotten the condescending it was good kind of stuff.
Right.
Like, it was great. Oh yeah, it was. I really enjoyed this dynamic. I enjoyed that dynamic. I have some questions here. Did you leave that out on purpose, or did I find a flaw in your story? It's all been like good, solid critiques, and that's been very encouraging for me.
That's great. Yeah, I'm very excited for this to come out, as should everyone else, which by the time this video comes out, you should be able to go check the Kickstarter and we will have the links in our blah blahs.
April 30th.
April 30th. So let's quickly move on to just a few rapid fire questions so that we can get to know you, Ray Jameson, just a little bit more before we wrap up. I would like to know, have you gone to any conventions? Let's start with that first. Have you gone to any conventions?
I live out in Winnipeg. We do have a Comic-Con every fall. I've been there a bunch of times. I've taken my kids a couple times. Lots of fun. I love cons. I love meeting celebrities when they come down, and it's great.
Okay, who have you met? Like who? Give me like your top three or
Top three?
anything.
Well, off the top of my head, as I mentioned, my brother's a big comic fan. He loved the Incredible Hulk. I got to meet Lou Ferrigno. That was cool.
Woo, that's awesome.
Ray Park.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't remember the guy's name. Gustavo Fring, who played Fring.
Oh, I can't remember his name, but oh wow. Okay, I'm gonna have to look it up real quick.
Lots of individuals.
Giancarlo Esposito. Does that sound right?
Esposito, that's the one. That's
Okay.
right. Yes.
He's amazing.
It was really nice to. I also met Billy Boyd, played Pippin Took in Lord of the
Oh,
Rings.
wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting faces come to Winnipeg.
Yeah. Wow. Well, gosh, yeah, I've never been, but I think now I need to go.
Make sure you're coming when the sun's out and not the snow.
Oh, really? Is it really snowy there?
Well, we have a joke. It's called winter peg here. Depending on the year, it can get as high as plus 40 in Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. It can also get as cold as minus 40.
Wow.
40 below
Wow.
zero, I should say.
Wow. Hopefully all the conventions are not during the winter.
Usually it's just before anything chaotic comes out with the cold.
Okay. Are you a Star Trek or Star Wars person or neither?
I'm not a hardcore fan of either, but I do appreciate both. I like the idea of Star Wars, of the focus on the individual and slaying the evil king, and that's essentially the original trilogy. I really appreciate that. Star Trek I appreciate on a different level. Star Trek is all the cool stuff going on, but it's not about the cool stuff, it's about the characters.
Yeah.
The Next Generation, there's a good episode. My brother is a big Trekkie. It's the only reason I can recall this so acutely, but there's an episode called A Measure of a Man where Data is put on trial and it's discussed whether or not he's his own property or Federation property.
Yes.
None of that has to do with planets and phasers and monsters. It's really into it. My comic is actually a lot in that respect. It's scaled down. There's no like multiversal or universal or world threat. It's about 4 people in a city. Yeah, both Star Wars and Star Trek I respect for different reasons.
Your assessment of Star Trek, The Next Generation, I think I have never heard that before. And I think I will take that away with me now, thinking about it, because you are very correct. And now I think it makes me respect Star Trek that much more.
I think the reason I like that so much is because it shows they don't rely on the icing. Like there's a lot of substance to it. If you have a lot of fans of lore, you could talk about anything in the lore, not necessarily the icing on the cake.
Right.
In this case, Data, are you a human? I don't know. Am I sentient? Beats me. Well, let's talk about that for an hour.
Yeah.
Wasn't that awesome, you know?
It sounds to me, okay, sorry. I am going to veer off here because I'm
All
so
good.
intrigued. Do you write? Have you written anything else? Do you write anything else? Are you a big reader?
I'm a fan of storytelling, I guess is the best way to put it.
You can tell. That's why I'm asking.
One thing my friends bug me about this, I remember things about people that define them. So my friend will tell me, he says, once I had this bad dream, and he'll start, I said, you told me this when we were in high school. And I finished the story for him. He says, how do you remember that? Because it left a big impact on you. I have a coworker, we're very similar, and he worded it this way. He says, I'm like a duckling, and I imprint myself on others. And I kind of felt like similar. Like every human being to me is their own TV show. And when something happens, well, that reminds me from season 2, episode this, when this happened, that gives me more context there.
Yeah.
Things really resonate with me, and I really find a lot of meaning in storytelling.
I just, I had to veer off because you have made some very insightful statements, and the way that you talk about storytelling, it's just intriguing to me. I feel like if you aren't a regular regular writer that you should be. And again, with, you know, the future plans of comics, I know you don't have anything necessarily that you're trying to like steer it in that direction, but I feel like if you don't, you should find some way to get writing. I think you sound like a natural writer, which is so. Anyway, sorry, I'm just fangirling
Well,
over here.
I'll extrapolate a little bit on that. I used to draw a lot of comics. I took a comic course when I did it for 2 years in a row, and it gave you the fundamentals of making a comic, establishing your character, establishing paneling, the pencil, the inks, the coloring, the lettering, the works. I've always wanted to make a comic, and deep down, I am an artist at heart, but I grew up and I couldn't make my passions my job, and I just like expressing stuff. We mentioned the board game earlier. I just
Right.
wanted to express that. This story, the same thing. I really like this story and I need to get it out of my system. I feel
Yeah.
like if I didn't do it, I'd feel like a shark that couldn't swim.
Yeah, that's what I usually hear though about people who do become either authors or storytellers or something of that nature, is that they just have to get the story out. It doesn't
Yes.
matter that they're not trying to make money off of it, or they're not trying to build it into a thing. They just have to get it out. They
With
need the
one
world to know it.
stipulation. One stipulation. I wanted to make sure that when I did express it, I gave it the justice it deserved. I didn't want to do like metaphorically 60% and say, your imaginations can fill out the rest. That was my only leashing dynamic, for lack of better wording.
Yeah. All right. One final get to know you question. If you had to be on a deserted island, what would be like the three things that you would want to bring with you?
Three things. Well, magnifying glass would definitely be one. My eyes aren't doing too great. I shouldn't say they're not doing too great. My eyes aren't like they used to be. I can still see pretty well. I definitely need a prescription. It also multitasks as a maker of fire, so
Yeah.
that would be very useful.
I was gonna say, why not just bring glasses? But there you go. It serves another purpose.
A decent size magnifying glass, great one. If it's just survival, I don't know what the other two would be. I think some type of a blade or pocket knife might be a smart one.
Okay. What if it wasn't survival? What if it was just
If I
you
could
just
live in
had three
any
things for the rest of your life on a deserted island?
deserted island, I would still want a blade for carving. I could do something with that. I think I'd still have the magnifying glass. It's a tough question. I don't know what the third thing would be.
Well, we'll just put a question mark in there. It'll be like a little surprise box, and you'll go, "Oh, this is the thing I needed." I see. I feel like maybe we can't end it on that. I need to ask one more question because you didn't have a third thing. What about like a book or series that you would recommend to someone else?
Book or a series? I'm going to go comic one, and I'm going to keep it light. So when I was a kid, there's a famous comic writer named Peter David. There's nobody that can contest this. He's easily the best Incredible Hulk writer ever.
Yeah.
He wrote a novel. It's called What Savage Beast, and it has to do with Bruce Banner becoming a dad, essentially.
Oh, wow.
It has to do with, I don't know if you read a lot of Hulk. He has a future evil version of himself that tries to take these newborn babies away.
Oh, wow.
And it's a wild trip. It's really, really crazy.
Where can people find your Kickstarter? Well, I mean, I'll have the link in the blah blahs,
For
but
sure.
any links, any websites, any pages that you want to share that you want
Sure.
people to see to find you?
Okay, so I'm on Facebook as DM Ray. DM being short for Dungeon Master, of course. You can find me on Instagram, Raymond the DM. Unfortunately, DM Ray was taken. You can find my Facebook page for the Madcaps. And lastly, of course, there's the Kickstarter. I've just surpassed 110 followers. This is my first go, and as I already said, I've been playing tabletop for over 10 years. I know I've already said this before, but if this is even remotely interesting, and this is something that you would want to see come to fruition, if you are to buy into this, you are supporting one of your own. And I'll talk a little bit about the add-ons in the campaign. I can't show you right now. We have miniatures of all 4 characters. We have, did I say this part earlier? I've lost track.
No, well, even if you did, I will cut that out in
Okay,
the
I'll
beginning
say
and
it
put it here.
Okay, well, anyways, miniatures. I've got a D20. It's based off of the Madcaps logo. I have laser engraved on wood the main inks of the main cover, which is of all 4 of them. I also have a map which shows where this story takes place. On the comic book side, I've got variant covers, I've got pinup, I've got sketch covers. This is very much fantasy and RPG as it is a comic book. I've used this joke before on another stream. My late father's from Northern Ireland, and I always roll my eyes if somebody walks up to me and says, "I've got Irish friends." I didn't want this comic book to be like, it's a comic book that happens to have some fantasy in it. No, it's just as much fantasy as it is comic book.
I love that. And I think you touched on a very good point about, you want to do something that's a little bit different. And I think there is this, you mentioned that you felt like there wasn't a whole lot of crossover between comics and necessarily D&D, but I do feel like there is enough crossover that there will be and D&D or tabletop in general, I mean, is just kind of exploding with interest right now. People are consuming everything they can about D&D, whether it's, YouTube videos or, live play sessions or anything. There's books that are just like fan stories.
Fan fiction.
Yeah, fan fiction of D&D stuff.
Third-party modules.
Going like crazy. And so this is something I think that people can tap into as another part of their interest. And it also branches off into something else. It will feel different to the people who love D&D or tabletop. This will be something different. And then for the people who love comics and maybe want to stretch out into something, this will feel different. So I do feel like this is enough of a niche that it could be very captivating. I'm very excited to see where this goes for you. It's a cool idea. And the art looks amazing. The story sounds amazing. I love all the depth that you've given some of these characters and their backstories. I'm just really interested.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Really, you don't know until you're thrown in it's trial by fire, really. I think the big advantage to this one is there's no external sources. What's the term? With the shekels comes the shackles. I'm not bounded by sponsors to make sure I show this specific dynamic or anything like that. I can just tell a raw story from the heart and just enjoy it for what it is. Comic books, as you've already touched up on, I'll say it in my own words, capes get a lot of attention in comics. We should be giving things like cloaks some attention too, for a change. If you buy into this, you're supporting one of your own. And anybody who last year when they watched Honor Among Thieves, the D&D movie, if you knew anybody that watched it that wasn't a D&D fan and you can finally say, yes, I feel validated, you like something that I do all the time, this is another opportunity to do that. If you're somebody that reads comics and they actually liked the story, you just, without realizing it, you liked what I liked. Like you and I both...
You've introduced them to tabletop.
Yes, and you and I both can probably relate to back at a time where tabletop, or D&D in this case especially, wasn't a popular thing to do. It was actually quite much the punchline to a joke.
Yes.
We've come full circle where now we can openly talk about it, and it's really, really easy to get people to recognize it through other forms of media. This comic is just another form of media to do such a thing.
Right. Yeah. I fully agree. I am going to wish you the best of luck with your Kickstarter. Folks, when this video comes out, the Kickstarter should also be out. I'm assuming this will be out on the same day, April 30th. Make sure you check the blah blahs for the link for the Kickstarter. And I just wish you the best of luck. I can't wait to see where this goes. We should check in 6 months down the road. And that's a question. How long is your Kickstarter going to go for? Do you know?
30 days.
30 days. Okay. 30 days, so yes. From April 30th, you have 30 days to get on this. Okay. It was a pleasure having you, Ray. And
I had fun. Thank you very much for having me.
I wish you the best.
A brawny intellectual, a devout farmer, a good-hearted charlatan, and a social facilitator. This circle of friends shall reunite in their hometown, Ivywood. Before they can depart for employment, they are interrupted by a local drug problem which carries hidden, sinister undertones. Can they survive the night? And what is the source of this danger? The bond amongst these friends may be the only metric to answer such questions.
Go check out and back the Madcaps Kickstarter now before it's too late. Make sure you like and subscribe for more interviews like this, and thanks for getting pretty nerdy with us.